for joining us for what looks to be already a very well-attended first event in our series of workshops. I just wanted to take a second to introduce this initiative and kind of explain what our goals are for the coming year. We are a graduate student-led initiative that's funded by the UC Humanities Research Institute. So as some of you might have noticed, unfortunately, most of our events, just like this one, will be always on California time, at least for the next year. So this is a UC-based initiative that just over the course of conversations with other graduate students who are focusing on STS in the UC system over the last couple of years, there's been so much exciting research that's been going on, but just given the fairly novel nature of a field, at least compared to other fields and subfields, there's somewhat of a dearth of graduate programs and thus programs of professional development. So this is a graduate student-led initiative where we're going to put on one workshop or panel at least once a month. We're planning on doing so for the next year. We'll be funded through 2021, and even if we are UC based and we will be on this time zone, I would never go so far as to say that this is a silver lining of the pandemic, but one advantage that we have had moving everything to Zoom is that we can open up these opportunities to graduate students, not only nationally, but internationally. A lot of you are joining us from, I think, Hannah, it was 5 different continents. We've gotten really fantastic feedback on the program, and we're also hoping to continue past this year to establish these networks and kind of keep this going. So I'm going to put in the chat our email and our website. A lot of you found us via Twitter. I'll put that in there as well. If you are a graduate student who has any kind of feedback for us, whether it's ideas for future workshops, if you have ideas about how this event went, please don't hesitate to contact us. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us. We're overwhelmed by the response that we've had to this panel already. So Hannah, I will leave it to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So thank you to the UCHRI and to the Center for Science, Technology, Medicine, and Society here at UC Berkeley for hosting us, and to our 5 just incredible panelists joining us from across the country. And thank you to Morgan Ames for agreeing to co-host this event with us and for being such a wonderful moderator already. And thank you to the 103 and growing members of this audience for joining us for this, our kickoff event for the STS Futures Initiative. I will introduce everyone in a second, but first wanted to just introduce the panel and the impetus behind it. The academic monograph has long been the cornerstone of the tenure file in the humanities and in many social science fields, and sometimes it's not just one. Despite its centrality, how books get made is too frequently part of the hidden curriculum of the academy, neither addressed in graduate school, of course, where you're working on the dissertation, nor necessarily afterwards in the postdoc or in those first crucial years of an assistant professor job. At the same time, many junior academics are moving out of the academy and are also simultaneously increasingly thinking about writing books for trade presses, either alongside or instead of the traditional academic monograph. Over the course of the next almost 2 hours, we're going to look at both routes to publication, from dissertation or parallel project to book proposal and eventually to book. Morgan and I have prepared some questions that we'll ask our panelists to walk us through the possible routes to publication quite schematically, we hope, as part of the demystifying. But of course, please write in the chat, as Morgan said, and we'll be keeping on top of that. And as you all already know, as you're here to hear them, we have a wide range of illustrious and really fabulous guests who work at various points of this process, from developmental editing to creative design, and several are authors as well, in addition to their editorial work. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce them and get out of the way. So Katie Helke has been with the MIT Press in various roles since 2007, and she is currently the editor of the STS list, which has been her role since 2014. I don't know if you want to wave as we go or whatever you'd like to do. Hi, Katie. Thank you for joining us. Audra Wolfe is a writer, editor, and historian based in Philadelphia. Her editorial and publishing consulting company, The Outside Reader, supports the work of scholars and scholarly publishers. She has previously worked at UP's University of Pennsylvania Press and Rutgers University Press. And she's the author of 2 books of her own, Freedom's Laboratory, The Cold War Struggle for the Soul of Science, 2018, and Competing with the Soviets, Science, Technology, and the State in Cold War America, 2013. And bylines across the Washington Post, Atlantic, Slate, and so on. And you can find Audra online on Twitter at Cold War Science. Moira Weigel is a writer, scholar, and founding editor of Logic magazine. She is the author of Labor of Love, The Invention of Dating, FSG Books, and the co-editor of the just released Voices from the Valley 2020 FSG Originals by X Logic. She received her PhD in Comp Lit and Film and Media from Yale in 2017, and then spent the subsequent 3 years at the Harvard Society of Fellows. She's currently a fellow at Data and Society Institute, and next year will be joining the faculty of Northeastern University in Communication Studies. Xiaowei Wang is the creative director also of Logic magazine. They are also the author of Blockchain, Chicken Farm, and Other Stories of Tech in China's Countryside, also just released, 2020 FSG by Logic. Caroline Eisenman is a literary agent at the Francis Goldine Agency in New York, representing both nonfiction and fiction authors. The list is incredible, and I encourage you to go look at the full list online at Francis Goldine Agency. Authors represented by Caroline have won a bunch of different prizes, including the Pushcart Prize, an NEA writing grant, and appeared on the shortlist for the National Book Award. Thank you so much for joining us. And then just quickly, Morgan Ames, importantly, is an assistant adjunct professor here at UC Berkeley in the School of Information. And Morgan is also the associate director of the Center for Science, Technology, Medicine, and Society. Her book, The Charisma Machine, The Life, Death, and Legacy of One Laptop per Child, came out last year from MIT Press and was also the winner of the 2020 Best Information Science Book Award. Hi, Morgan. And I'm Hannah Zeven. I'm a lecturer in the departments of English and History, also at UC Berkeley, and also a faculty affiliate of the Center for Science, Technology, Medicine, and Society. My first book is coming out next year. It's called The Distance Cure, A History of Teletherapy, also from MIT Press. Other work is appeared or forthcoming at American Imago, the LARB, Real Life Magazine, Slate, Somatosphere, and elsewhere. And for the sake of this very specific conversation, I'm also represented by Jim Ruttman at Sterling Lord Literistic, which is an agency, a lit agency in New York City. Okay, enough of me. Morgan's going to kick us off. And again, thank you all for joining us.
Wonderful, Hannah. Thank you for that generous intro. And I'm so excited to be here. So I want to have a first question that kind of starts at the beginning, right? Many of you in the audience are maybe finishing your dissertation, or you've just finished, and you know you want to turn it into a book, or maybe you have to turn it into a book, right? As part of your academic path. So Audra, I want to aim this first question at you. I imagine you get contacted by a lot of people who have just finished their dissertation and are asking, okay, now what, right? What do you say to them? What do you say is the kind of the ideal path here?
I'm assuming you called on me. It got garbled just a minute. Yes? Yes? Okay.
Yes, sorry.
Yeah, so I would say about half of the people I work with are probably working on their first books. And the best advice that I can always give someone when they call me in that situation is first to take some time if you have it. I think most people who work with these books will tell you that they are better if they sit for at least a year before you really think about what they're going to be as a book. I realize that for all kinds of practical reasons, that's not always possible. But if you have the opportunity to let it sit for a while, books that start as dissertations almost always benefit from that time. And the main reason why they benefit from that time is because you need to ask bigger questions. I mean, you don't have to ask bigger questions. There are plenty of first books that in fact just do what they do in the dissertation. And if you can get the book out in that way and you can get it out quickly, good for you. I mean, if that, sometimes the point of a first book is to get it out, and that is worth doing if that's your goal. But if you do want to make some kind of social intervention, these books will usually benefit from thinking about what's a new question? You know, part of the point of a dissertation, really as a credentialing device, is to show that you are conversant with ongoing conversations in your field, that you know how to take a body of evidence and construct an argument that is legible to the people who are currently specialists in your field. And that's great, it's important work. But for a book, ideally, one of the things that really makes a book feel exciting is if you're asking a new question. Maybe something that the existing literature doesn't even really think of in this way. And so you're maybe bringing together disparate literatures and framing things in a new way. And you're really allowing yourself to focus on, why does my topic or why does my intervention matter in the world as well? And why would it matter to readers? Which is, you know, often a slightly different question than what is my intervention in my discipline?
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I would love to turn this same question to Katie. So you have, of course, a lot of experience with people possibly a little farther along, but I imagine you also get emails from people who maybe say, I just finished my dissertation, I want to write a book, where do I start, right? Do you have anything you would add to Audra's wonderful advice on how to approach this?
Yeah, I would just say, I mean, Audra is perfectly right. She hit it right on the head there. I think giving yourself some time, it is a red flag when someone says, like, I just defended, I'm done, and my book proposal is like ready to go. I think 99 times out of 100, I know that I don't even need to look at it. I know it's not ready to go. And I think that's true of most writing. Like it's good to just step back and take some space and look at it with some fresh eyes. And then also think about who your audience is. And you're not just communicating to your committee anymore. You are hopefully talking to a much broader audience. And I think that there's then some more leeway to work with tone and work with style and try to make your argument engaging and appealing on an even broader level. And that's something that I'm always attracted to when I see, of course, I'm looking for an original argument and something that's going to move a field forward. But if you can do that and say it in an interesting and engaging way, that's pleasant for your readers. And I think you're also more likely to be recognized for your work down the line in academic circles too, and sometimes beyond.
Great, thank you so much. One just small follow-up, and then I'll hand things over to Hannah for a little while. Audra, could you clarify what the role of a developmental editor is and when someone might seek one out, especially since you said that many or half of your clients are first-time book writers? Yeah,
so developmental editing is a term that can mean a lot of different things, but it boils down to making books better. Developmental editing, it's very different, say, from copy editing, which is very much about kind of enforcing house style. It can be a version of line editing, which in line editing, you take a manuscript and you basically are making the sentences sing. Kind of you're making the writing as it exists on the page sing. True developmental editing, though, is more interventionist than that. It's kind of at a different scale. It's really editing for argument, for evidence, for salability, for flow. It's really about making a book intellectually coherent. And so there are a lot of developmental editors out there. They work different ways. I tend to work in a two-phase process where I give people I really am looking what they have and we're talking about it. I'm kind of giving them a report that's looking at what they have and what their options are. And I'm having a long conversation with the author to really figure out, what do you actually want to do with this material? And then kind of starting from there, once we have a clearer sense of what they actually want to do with the material, think about, what would a book look like that accomplishes that goal? And then how do you take the text that you have and turn it into the text that you want it to be? And so then after we do that, then maybe it actually starts to look like editing. Maybe I'm, helping a person redraft topic sentences and transition sentences, or maybe I'm helping somebody convert a book that's arranged thematically into a chronological format, or vice versa, or something else. It's a lot of things, but it boils down to making books better. And I should just say that some of us in this area also do some things that are called publishing consulting, which is a lot like, it's some of the same functions of agenting, but arranged differently, because most of my clients are not going to be getting the kind of advances that would make it work financially for an agent. And I'm sure we'll come back to that later. So I'll just pin that for now.
A wonderful transition to this question I'm going to ask also Caroline. So let's say we've followed Audra's advice to the T. We've taken 6 months to a year off or longer. And now we're ready to go back in so that we're not 99 out of 100 for Katie, and we're going to do the book proposal. So part of what one has to do, whether it's the dissertation that one is rearranging and working through, or a parallel project, is decide what kind of book, academic or trade, or the sort of in-between of academic trade. So I'm interested from all of our panelists in hearing some advice about how one can decide for oneself what kind of book. Of course, there are various kinds of pressures, whether they be from being on the tenure track or not, and what are the differences between the various forms. And I was wondering, Caroline, if you could just tell us a little bit about, from the trade side, what you look for in a more heavily researched but still definitely trade nonfiction book.
That's a great question. I think one of the things that distinguishes sort of the trade perspective most from the academic perspective is, who is the audience? Who is this subject being framed for? From an academic perspective, it's always being framed from for an expert, for somebody who knows the subject quite deeply. It's meant to advance research in the field. It's meant to expand ideas that have already been explored. But that is how it's fundamentally framed. Trade is framed for a lay reader. And for that reason, whatever the topic is, whatever the idea is, there need to be elements of that framing that invite a lay reader in, whether it's sort of making it clear what the contemporary resonance of that topic is, whether it is sort of gesturing out to larger questions, whether it's framing the topic in a way that would make it just immediately intriguing to somebody who maybe had no exposure to that field or that subject before. Because the perspective of a trade book is always, if this is a science book, we're hoping to reach science readers, but we're also hoping to reach general readers, people who maybe read 1 or 2 science books a year, but who find something very inviting or intriguing about the idea or the treatment of that idea. And I think crossover is kind of somewhere in between the two. Like, perhaps it has a little bit more of that trade sensibility, and that it's not aimed for an absolute expert, but it's maybe positioned for a reader who might be willing to work a little bit harder in terms of entering the subject, or sort of approaches the book willing to sort of perhaps take on a subject that might seem on its face more obscure in its interests than a sort of straight trade book might be.
Great, thank you so much for that. That's really helpful. And maybe we could hear now, to bring in 2 of our other panelists, how Xiaowei and Moira decided to write your books with huge academic worth, but for a trade audience.
Xiaowei, do you want to go first, or should I go first?
I can go first.
I think I forgot to tell you earlier, Hannah, that so my home department is actually geography, and I'm currently a PhD student in geography at Berkeley. And so it is this like weirdness of having written a book, but also having the book not be my dissertation. I think for me, that framing element that Caroline was talking about is exactly that, right? I felt very excited to be able to take all of the kind of bigger theoretical and also field research that I had been thinking about and living through, and then frame it in a way where it did feel more accessible to a general audience. And, you know, I think, yeah, that really was kind of one of the highlights of writing a trade book.
Yeah, I think it's funny because I realized I wish there had been events like this when I was a graduate student, because I think everything I did was just so sort of intuitive and, you know, happened as it went. But for me with my first book, it was really coming out of and based on work I was doing alongside my dissertation. Was I even writing my dissertation then? I can't even remember, but it was sort of like separate work. And I often would think, when I thought about this question, a bit at a tangent of this Robert Frost line, where Robert Frost in this lecture says, and he's talking about the length of poetry lines, which is different, but he says, you carry different freight at different speeds. And it just like, you can do different things in these different genres. And I think, you know, both in my own writing, and I've done academic writing and sort of popular or general writing, whatever that means. I don't love either of those adjectives, but in my own work, and then also sort of editing folks at Logic and working on the Logic books a bit with the authors, I think that I've come to feel that in many ways, just, and as everyone's already saying, that these genres are just different and that you can do different work. I mean, Zhao Wei is able to do such amazing things in her new book, Blockchain Chicken Farm, recommended by the New York Times, that everyone should go check out, that you can just do, I mean, your book does these essayistic things and these reflective things that you just couldn't do in an academic book. And you could absolutely write a brilliant academic book about some of the subject matter you research, but it would just move in a different way and do different work. And so that's a slightly roundabout answer, but I think part of it for me had to do with my relation to the material and how it came about, and then also what kind of moves I wanted to make in the book, which of course also did relate to this question of audience and who I imagined reading it. But I do think, sorry, then I'll stop going on and on, but I think that both, at least historically in my experience of these two worlds, the sort of media, non-academic publishing world and then academic world can sometimes have, how to put it, like this idea that sometimes one encounters the idea that each is like a lesser version of the other, depending which side of the divide you're on. And I guess I've really come to think that these different kinds of writing just do different kinds of work. And that's the more useful way, you know, not to think of the trade version as like simplifying something that would be told another way, but as a text that moves in a different way and towards different readers potentially.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I would love to turn a little bit towards kind of whether it's a trade book or an academic book, what kinds of things you look for in book proposals. And I might throw this first to Caroline and talk a bit about the agent-client relationship. Who needs an agent? Yeah, tell us a little bit about that, and then take us forward into kind of what you look for in a proposal.
Who needs an agent? Who knows? I mean, to get in the door at most trade presses, you need an agent. That is really, if your aspiration is to write a book that is published by a trade publisher, you'll need an agent. More mixed at university presses, but I think still an agent's job is to do developmental work before a project is presented to editors, to really try and, on a conceptual level, take it to its sort of furthest place before it sort of takes the leap from proposal to book. And that can be very foundational work. That can be work that relates to the ideas and how they're pitched and presented in sort of a dense, sort of condensed form, and also the structure of the work, the narrative or the argument of the work, and sort of how it flows. And I would say that's another place where, you know, Moira sort of touched on stylistically that there are some differences between a trade approach and an academic approach. I also think structurally there's often differences in those different approaches. Trade readers want to feel that they're sort of being guided in a certain way through a book, whether it's by a story or by sort of the building of ideas in a certain sort of arc or shape. So I mean, honestly, I think one thing that I look for from book proposals and book ideas from a trade perspective is there, again, that sort of really compact way of explaining the idea or explaining the subject of the book or the argument of the book or the narrative of the book that would make somebody who doesn't know anything about the topic interested. That is often a litmus test for me, is like, can I imagine picking up the phone to an editor and telling them what this book is about, and they, who maybe are not somebody who's ever read about this topic before or not super specialized in this field, would feel interest, because they then in turn need to sort of be able to spread that feeling to a reader who sort of is, again, from that position of a layperson. And I think, I mean, you see books which do tremendous academic work, but which have in some form or another that kind of you know, shiny core that kind of can make it work for trade, where there's some sort of very mobile center to the idea that can sort of help in positioning in that way to a lay reader.
Awesome, thank you so much. So I'd love to turn this around now and ask Katie a similar question. If we can get down a little bit more into the nitty gritty of what do you look for in a proposal, more from the academic side, but also, you know, insofar that MIT Press does do kind of crossover books, right? You can maybe address a little bit of that crossover question too. I know that's a conversation I had with you many years ago as well. But of course, you know, many of us embedded in the academic community are kind of beholden to academic press and the peer review there and all of that. So maybe tell us a little bit more concretely kind of what you look for in that proposal and yeah, how you shape that.
Yeah, I think it's actually very similar to Caroline. I do acquire trade books and academic books and crossover books. So just as someone who, with no background in STS, it's nice to come into any proposal and be intrigued by what's the topic, what's the argument here. Very importantly, is this person a clear writer? Have they put some thought into not bombarding me with jargon, but just trying to say something that's clear and intriguing and straight to the point, really. So, I mean, generally, I suppose that's what I look for. All editors you should ever approach will have proposal guidelines, which you can find on academic press websites, or if you know of the editor who lines up with your discipline, just reach out to that editor directly and ask them if they have specific guidelines, which I do, and they should be happy to send those to you. So yeah, the pretty standard stuff of what's this book about? Who is it talking to? What's your market? All of that. So did I answer that question, Morgan? I'm sorry, it's a little bit late, and I realize I'm not firing on all cylinders at this point in the day.
No, you're wonderful. Thank you. Moira, do you have anything to add with your experience with logic, obviously, and your own experience as a writer?
Oh, thanks. Lots of thoughts. I mean, in terms of pitching articles or in terms of book proposals or either?
Well, I think that the topic is certainly book proposals, but
Yeah.
you know, how it fits into a kind of broader publishing strategy maybe would be an interesting direction.
Thanks. Yeah, well, I think, and Jiawei should jump in because they're on all the same logic commissioning meetings as I am. But I think that, I've done a couple of book proposals at this point now. I've done trade, I've done academic, and I can think of those differences, but there are people on this call who can speak to those differences probably more expertly than I can. When we get a pitch at Logic, for what it's worth, I often ask the questions, and hopefully I'll get them in the right order, of sort of what, it's like what, why, who. I want to know what, why, who at least. And it's like, what is this piece about? And of course, we're talking about a couple paragraphs, not a book proposal kind of thing here, but it's like, what's this piece about? Why is Logic the right home for it? Or like, why would Logic readers be interested in it? And I guess the last question is kind of a why too, but who are you and why are you the person rather than any other person to write about this piece? And I guess I often want to know how too. It's like, depending on what kind of thing it is, how are you going to get the information or do the research involved in it? And I think, again, for an article, the stakes are much different, but knowing answers to those basic questions help. I was curious what Carolyn thought. I guess for one of my book proposals, I did have to have sort of like a writing sample or a kind of proof of concept. Usually there's a chapter or two, I guess, from my first trade book, I think. And then for others, I didn't. So I wondered too if that's part of what you think about when you work with authors on their proposals, because I imagine that might be that was a thing I had to learn for the first time when I was doing my first proposal. So maybe that's worth mentioning too.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think particularly for first book proposals, and then there are other instances if you're doing a really different book than a book you've done before. I mean, the sample chapter is the what. Like, what is this book going to feel like? Like, I often think of book proposals in terms of those questions that Myra was running through too. The sort of the introduction will run through the what and the why. The structural will run through the how. And then I guess I've already said what, but the sample material is like, what is it going to feel like to be inside of this book? What is this book going to read like? And, there are book proposals where maybe they wrote a really extensive introduction and maybe the chapter outlines are really meaty. And you just feel like, it's pretty clear how this author writes, and the book proposal is 40 pages already. Like, do we really need to add another 30 pages of sample writing? But I often think that, while you can get away with not having them, I think many times editors like having them rather than not having them. They it's just this additional piece of something to make concrete what this sort of book will end up being.
And I guess also just, and maybe this is redundant, but a very practical piece of advice that was relevant to how things played out for me with my first book, and then is something I've talked with other authors about, is that if one is an academic, if you are an academic wanting to do a trade thing, but you haven't done a lot of that, at least in my lived experience and other people I know, it is often a good strategic idea to try to do some articles and see, what travels or what catches a bit, so that, the first agents you approach have a sense of how you write and how folks respond to it. So often I think like when friends are working on this, I say, before you try to write the entire book, for years and then go to the agent, maybe try to pitch a few articles and get a sense of response. And actually, if I may say just one more thing about that, I think also as academics, we're often socialized to be, clearly a lot of the socialization and professionalization of grad school is about being so careful and like getting things, just working very, very hard on something before you ever show it to anyone. And I remember I worked in magazines for a minute before I went back to grad school, and remember hearing a senior editor say, I hate to get a pitch and it's so perfect and I can tell someone worked on it for 6 months and like, actually we're running another article about that next month and I just can't, like, there's no way. And sometimes I think it's not such a bad idea to be a little more ready to just, send a few lines to, especially to a magazine editor or something that's lower stakes, and just try things out and not do the thing I think we've all been trained to do through orals and all of our coursework of like feeling we have to go read 200 books before we can write someone an email.
I guess I would also just want to add one more thing to that, which is that a proposal for trade, at least, like, that's not the finished product. Like, that's another important point to build on, is like when you're approaching maybe not editors, but agents, like there can be a little bit of looseness there. They're going to work with you on it. And then an editor is going to have things that they see that they're going to bring to the project too, as it expands out to book length. So I think that's also an important point to keep in mind, just a little bit more of that looseness, that it doesn't, I mean, a proposal is a document that your agent's going to see and your editor's going to see, and then it's going to go away, and then it's going to become a book. And the best form of a proposal is like a great blueprint, but it's not something that's going to meet the world.
Thank you so much for all of this. This is really helpful. Maybe now if I could bring Katie and Audra back into the conversation, just to keep going back and forth between the academic and trade. How is the proposal different for an academic book? Is it more like a contract? It goes out for review. Can you speak a little bit more about that difference over and against the trade book?
Yeah, if I can hop into this, because it is very true that trade books and scholarly books are doing different things for different people. But at the same time, particularly when we're thinking about kind of STS and media studies fields, I think it's important to not overstate the university presses and the trade presses are in entirely different orbits, because they're not necessarily. There's much more of a spectrum, right? So even within the trade world, there's a spectrum of presses. You've got like Random House and HarperCollins, and then you've got like the smart trades, right? I mean, you've got your Basic, and you've got your Norton and your FSG that's doing logic, right? And then within the university press world, you've got your the most specialized monographs, but you also have the tradier part, even of the same press, and there's not a deep wall within that press. It's usually the same editor. So, a tradie book from Oxford, a tradie book from Harvard, the tradie books from MIT are not going to be that different. And so when an agent is representing a title that is kind of looks like it should go with the classy trades, that proposal is most likely still going to go to university press, to a handful of university presses who might be likely targets, right? And so there might be a difference in terms, there might be a difference of almost 10 in terms of how many copies of the book, say, Basic thinks it's going to sell versus how many copies, sorry, there's a fly here, versus how many copies NYU might think it's going to sell of a book. But in terms of the popular discourse around the book, if what you're really trying to do is change a conversation, that book published by NYU or MIT Press might still get the reviews in LARB. It might get the review, it might be in those conversations. Or if we think about, Race for Profit, the book about kind of banking, that won the national, it was a finalist for many of the National Book Award winners. So university presses can really be in that space. So all of that's a way of saying that the proposals for the crossover books may not look dramatically different. They may be different in terms of whether you have some formal elements of the proposal, whether they have a narrative overview or whether they're much more like, in this book, I argue X, Y, and Z. But they're not necessarily describing entirely different books. For a certain cluster of smart books that are really doing original research and making original arguments, the kinds of books that get published by both the tradier ends of the university press and the classy ends of the trades. So that said, what you're looking for in a good proposal, it needs to be skimmable, right? I think what I see all over and over again are authors who are really overthinking what the intellectual heft of the proposal needs to be, right? So even a book proposal for a scholarly monograph is a document that is meant to sell your book to gatekeepers, right? So it needs to be supremely skimmable. It needs to be pithy. It needs to be direct, and it needs to be accurate. It needs to not make ridiculous claims that it's going to be, the best book that's ever, the only book that's ever existed on X. And it needs to be generous, not only because these proposals are often peer reviewed, and the people who peer reviewed it are often who will likely peer reviewed are probably the people listing in the competing books, but also because publishing is, from a business perspective, it's a conservative industry. And so publishing works on models, right? So when you say in a competing book section that there has never been another book on X, what publishers see, and this goes for both university presses and the trades, what publishers see is there is no market for this book. So what you want to do is you want to convey that there are a group of people who are interested in the kind of thing that you're writing about, and that you're going to do it in a way that is novel and sharp and is going to participate in contemporary conversations. So that in some ways is one of the most important parts of the proposal, is this discussion of the competing books, because it really lets somebody see at a glance what kind of conversations you think you're participating in, where this book goes, either in a bookstore, if you're thinking on the tradier side, or which conferences it goes to, if you're thinking about kind of the more scholarly side. So really just kind of thinking about this document as it's different than a précis, and sometimes people send me documents that they've prepared for like their third year of their tenure, for their third year review if they're on the tenure clock, and you're doing a different thing with the book proposal. You can take a grant proposal and you can use that as a draft, but as a book in itself is written for a specific audience, a book proposal is written for a specific audience, and that audience is ultimately people who are going to make decisions about whether or not to publish your book. So you need to make a case for the fact that this book has a readership and that you in fact are going to be the best person to write it. And I'll move on to Katie in a minute, but I would just say, and that's another reason you should be doing those articles, because you need to have a compelling about the author section in which you can say, not only in which you're going to promise that you're going to write op-eds and do blog posts, but which you can say, and I have in the past, here they are. It's really important to do that. That's what publishers call platforms. And particularly if you're trying to get an agent, you need a platform.
Yeah, Audra, you said that perfectly. I suppose what I would add is just the proposal. I also need to be able to figure out quickly from the proposal whether or not this project fits on my list and with where I'm trying to take the list and the books that I work on my list. I've seen proposals that I think are wonderful, that are, most often I get things from like straight political science or law, and they look great. And I would love to read this. This sounds really compelling. I don't acquire a law list. So if I wanted to acquire the book, it would fall flat and it probably wouldn't perform very well because we aren't practiced in talking to law markets. So your proposal and your project might be wonderful and on the path to becoming a great book, but my list might just not be the right place for it. And that's something where the kind thing that you can do for your editor is just, this is why we're talking about clarity and being direct. I think the worst thing that you can do is make the editor work to try to figure out what you're trying to say. We just don't have the time to do that. And so when you're talking about how much polish should be on a proposal, some people can whip up a proposal in a weekend. Some people it takes a year. I don't really care either way. I just want to know that you've at least invested the initial thought. Put a proposal on my desk and expect me to figure it out for you at that stage. So I hope that doesn't sound rude, but if we're talking about the best chances for you to have an editor pick up your project and at least move to next steps, that's in your best interests. And yeah, I would echo what Caroline said in terms of the proposal is not the book. I think, your proposal will end up functioning for several audiences. At least I'm speaking from my experience at the MIT Press. I'm looking at it initially to see fit and what kind of a writer you are. Then it will go out to peer reviewers at some point. If we move forward, then it will be looked at by the marketing department down the line to just see where this started and what information we can pull from it. So proposal, it's not like it goes through one stage and then goes somewhere to die in the darkness. But you have opportunities to revise and refine, and it evolves along the way. So, and that's also a conversation you'll be having with your editor about making those revisions before you go out for review, or before, I don't know, before it goes to a series editor, if that's appropriate, or some such thing.
So maybe just to ask a follow-up question, we're all currently in, the land of mostly Zoom only. And traditionally on the academic side, one would meet prospective editors in STSA, in media studies, and whatever, of course, at the big conferences. What are the other ways that authors get connected to editors, given that all conferences are virtual? And how do we not waste the time of all of the editors and ensure a best fit? What research can authors do from home to think forward towards fit, even though, of course, personality and subject matter, et cetera, are all going to end up playing a role later down the road?
I can take that. I think that the first thing that you should do is look at the books on your own shelf, or look at the work that you're citing and see which press published those books, and sort of rank the frequency with which you see those presses, and you probably have the presses you should approach in order right there. You can check out the individual editor profiles on press websites. This is terrible advice for mine's so out of date. I think there's like incorrect information on there. I think my title's wrong. And so take that with a grain of salt, but you can go to editor websites and oftentimes they'll say like what they've worked on most recently. Follow them on Twitter. Just email us. We're not like behind a concrete wall that's like impenetrable. Just email us and say, I want to submit to you. How do I, do you want a full proposal? Do you want just a paragraph describing my work? If that's not written somewhere on their profile, just ask them. And I would be respectfully persistent in that. We all get a lot of emails, a lot of proposals, a lot of manuscripts coming in all the time. If I haven't written you back in a week or two, don't read anything into it. Just send me a gentle nudge, and then send me another one. And hopefully eventually we'll get back to you and let you know. This is what, the most helpful thing for me is I want a proposal. I want to see what your work is. I want to be able to read it in sample form, like on the written page. Whereas I have colleagues who the first thing that they want to do is jump on Zoom or talk to a person on the phone. I think it has to do with the personal preferences of the editor. And you shouldn't be afraid to write to someone and say, what would you prefer? If you could just give me a little bit of direction, I would really appreciate it. I consider that's part of my job. It is part of my job to advise you about how to approach me to get your book published.
Yeah, if I could just hop, in some ways, the pandemic really makes the absence of agents in the university press. Obviously agents do work with the university press, but they have a different role in the trade ecosystem. And I can see how it feels a lot more baffling. I think that the point of the academic conferences for university press publishers is to be a space where people can just kind of have more casual conversations. And it is definitely challenging to figure out how to make those connections. But I want to reiterate what Katie said about email and particularly Twitter. And follow the editors who are publishing in the fields that you want to work in. And sometimes they will even say things like, hey, I'm going to do an open house next week, and take advantage of that if they say that. If they are leaving chips out there saying, hey, I'd really like to talk with people, they mean it. They wouldn't be saying that if they weren't, they need authors too, in the same way that you need a publisher. There's only a certain number of books out there that they see as publishable, and they need to find those authors. Just one thing I didn't say earlier, some of you have probably seen these books, but of course there are resources out there to help you figure this out. Probably it's a little old now, but one of the best books out there, and of course it's reversed, it's called Thinking Like Your Editor, How to Write Great Serious Nonfiction and Get It Published. This is basically like the Bible of doing what they call serious nonfiction book proposals. It's great. It's very straightforward. It's very basic. It walks you through all of these issues of kind of what makes a compelling proposal. When it was written, I think there was a bigger gap between what the trade presses wanted and the university presses wanted. But I would say most university presses want you to be thinking about the same issues of audience that are talked about in here as if you would need them for the trade. So get this book. I'm sorry it's backwards, but as $20 investments go, it's a really great kind of tip to help figure out what makes a compelling book proposal.
And then, and thank you for that tip. Rebecca just shared the listing in the chat. And just to, before we move off this point, Caroline, can you talk a little bit about then, and Shaway and Moira too, if you want to jump in with your own experience, right? So then how do you, if you're going to go trade first or trade only, how do you query agents? And how do you figure out, if you're not going to query 100 agents, who might be the best bet and the best fit if you're starting from, you know, not a New York City PhD and no real experience with like publishing world and its conventions?
Sure. I mean, so with nonfiction for agenting, it flows in two directions more than fiction does. So nonfiction agents will approach writers that they think look interesting, either because of their academic background, perhaps because of their published journalistic work, or work in sort of more general publications. And just sort of, you know, you'll write the fan letter like, I read this, I thought it was interesting. If you're ever thinking about developing a trade book, you know where to find me. So that's one way that it happens. Obviously, that doesn't always happen. And, you know, I think the downside as an author of finding an agent that way is you only know who's approaching you rather than sort of, you know, who's out there, what do I want out of an agent? But I mean, every agent is open to being queried, to just being approached coldly in an email. I mean, we always like it more when it's a targeted query, when it's very clear why and how somebody showed up on our doorstep, when it's clear that they understand that either the subject that they're exploring or the way that they're approaching their subject is something that we like. Like I would say, for example, two books on my list are Jenny Odell's How to Do Nothing and Kyle Chayka's The Longing for Less. Like I have a real affinity for sort of this sort of ranging cultural criticism. You don't have to be writing about what they're writing about, but if you're writing in that way, I would love to hear from you. Even if you're just sort of, and I do have authors approach me who maybe have an impressive track record of publications, but don't have a full proposal yet. They have an idea. And depending on who they are, that might be a moment when I'm willing to engage in conversation. Maybe it's not the moment I'm going to sign them, but to start sort of the process of developing a proposal and see if it works, it makes sense to work together. That being said, the dream is for somebody to show up on your doorstep with a great proposal. Like that's Yahtzee, like, because nonfiction so often involves developing a proposal with somebody that it's exceptionally impressive when somebody shows up with a really well-developed idea already. And perhaps you have ideas for how to take it further, but the bulk of the work is already there. I mean, I think from a trade perspective, it's always a question, again, just to sort of bring it down for like, who's the writing for, who's the audience? Like, you know, is it clear that whatever their academic discipline is, they understand how to connect it and make it interesting to a general audience? Like, have they already sort of thought through those questions? Do they understand that kind of storytelling and that kind of argument versus the argument that might take it in a more academic press kind of direction? So, I mean, and I just think similarly to what Katie said, like, look at what's on your bookshelf. You know, agents are listed in the acknowledgements. There are resources like Publishers Marketplace that list what kind of sales agents are making, all kind of websites. We're all on Twitter wasting time. So, you know.
Yeah, I just want to add to that, actually, that I love hearing you describe that, Caroline, because with the FSG Originals Logic collaboration, Logic Magazine acted as kind of an agent. Moira, would you say that's?
Although my agent did like pro bono agent for us a little bit too.
Yes,
like I wasn't reading the legal documents.
Yeah, and so yeah, like even now, even though I've written a book, you know, and I think about like, oh, how do you find an agent? I'm like, oh, that sounds so daunting. And I think related to that, to what folks have been saying about book proposals, I mean, it's a different writing process for everyone, I feel like, but for me, it actually is really helpful to think of the book proposal as like, oh, I have these like tiny bits of like articles that I've been thinking about along the way doing my PhD, like research, a combination of like things that I want to get out there as essays. And those can be like chapters, and the chapters then could perhaps build to like this larger book. And that for me has been a much less daunting way of thinking about it than like, I'm just gonna write this book, here it is. And that's my tome. So I don't know if that's helpful for folks.
For what it's worth, at a really just totally pragmatic level, my experience finding an agent was that I heard from some agents and then at a certain point, and then set about trying to meet some others. And similarly, and looked like, I think I knew from people's acknowledgements, I knew from just like reading about the literary world, and also from, I did my PhD at Yale. I spent a lot of time in New York. I had like worked there. So that was a luck or a privilege that I had, but had like some sense of that world. But then just sent cold emails to some others who had worked on books that I admired and started talking to them. And so that was how because that process was mystifying to me. A friend had to explain that to me, but that was how that worked for me.
Yeah, I had just thought of something, which is I'm wondering if other folks on the panel could talk about presses where you don't need agents, like, smaller, like more sort of like niche presses where they're just like, we're open for submittals. Like it's one that I can think of. They just came out with a pretty kind of next level book about like AI generated text, like both very theoretical and also artistic Ignota books. And so it's like a press where you don't really need an agent to approach. Yeah, I'd be curious for folks' thoughts.
Did you want to talk about like non-university presses like that? Because there are just definitely, there are small presses doing great work, and they tend to be very specialized and sort of publishing almost in a university press way for a smaller, more specialized audience. And maybe that's more of a sort of literary nonfiction audience or, a specialized field. But they certainly exist. I mean, places where you can submit without an agent exist outside of the university press system as well. But again, in the same kind of way, they're thinking about publishing, I think, to a more sort of specialized reader.
Yeah, and on the university press side, I mean, you don't need an agent to work with the university press. That is a separate question than is an agent helpful? But that's also a separate question of the question of do you need an agent is sometimes a different question than can you get an agent? And that's just a question of finances, and that the kind of advances that we're talking about at university presses, unfortunately, sometimes make it challenging for agents to take people on as a client. And it's not anything about the value of the work or the value of the scholarship whatsoever. It's just that, agents have to keep the lights on too. And if they spend all their time working on books with, $2,000 to $5,000 advances, that's not going to happen. So, so you don't need an agent with the university press, but, certainly if you can, my second book was agented with, I worked with Deirdre Mullane for my second book, Freedom's Laboratory. And when I was an acquisitions editor at Rutgers, I signed sometimes books with agents, including one from Frances Golden herself back in the early 2000s. But they are helpful. They're really helpful, but you don't need them if you're working with the university press. It is absolutely acceptable to simply write to university press editors. It is their job to field your queries.
Katie, to add anything, being in that position, or do you see agents often?
Yeah, I get agented proposals often enough, and increasingly now that we're distributed by Penguin Random House. And we've also tried to be more vocal about the fact that we are doing big trade as well as our scholarly books. So I think when agents know that and know that we are invested on that side, we're just more likely to get more proposals that way. It is there can be some subtle differences between proposals that you'll get from an agent versus just from an individual author. I think there will be a lot more focus on platform. Platform is certainly important if you want to write a trade book, but I just generally don't see that much focused on that from individual authors. And really good agents function like really good editors, and there are proposals that'll come my way. Like Caroline was saying, sometimes like if you'll get a proposal that's totally baked when it arrives to you, it is like a gift from the heavens. And so there are some trusted agents I know who I just think whatever is going to come through this person is it's gonna sing for me. And on the flip side, I know there are some agents where I think whatever comes through this person is not going to sing for me. So yeah, I'm perfectly happy to work particularly with that first set of agents. It changes some aspects of the process on the front end, but otherwise the same book hopefully comes out the other side. So
we had a couple questions now about developmental editors. Margot asked one way at the beginning, and we just had one from Travis as well. Mark asks, to have a developmental editor seems like wonderful help. How do we get to work with one? Do we need a book contract first? How do you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I would say it's a word of mouth industry, and how you find your developmental editor will often depend on when you're bringing them into the process. If you're looking for a developmental editor before you have a contract, perhaps because you're having trouble getting a contract, a good way to do that is going to be to ask your colleagues. More people have worked with these editors than you think they have, particularly in sociology. It's extremely common in sociology for people to work with developmental editors. We're around. Google isn't necessarily the best way to do it because there are people who are selling services that maybe aren't the right fit for people working on scholarly manuscripts. If you're further along in the process and you have a contract and you find that you need more editorial input than your acquisitions editor can give you, you can ask them if they have suggestions, because in the same way that Katie was just saying a well-prepared proposal makes her job easier, sometimes people are worried that their acquisitions editor will think it's cheating in some ways if you use a developmental editor. No. They are going to, this is solving a problem for them if you say that you want to work with a developmental editor. And they're going to know people who work well in your field. The bigger issue, I'll just be honest, is cost. Developmental editing is not cheap. And in the university press world, it's fairly rare for the university press to pay for it. It happens every now and then, especially if a press has put out a big advance for a book that didn't come in the way they were expecting, and for a variety of reasons, they want to work on making it better instead of pulling the contract. But most of the time, when people are hiring a developmental editor, if they're working with the university press, the author is paying for it. And they might be paying for it out of pocket, or they might be using research funds. But the costs vary. Most developmental editors charge by the hour because it's not the kind of work that you can do, or by the project, because it's not necessarily like a per word kind of project. And the rates are going to vary dramatically. Most developmental editors who work with scholars are going to charge between $75 to $150 an hour is pretty typical. The ones who work in the trade, the ones who have trade experience, can go significantly higher than that. So it does vary. It is an investment. It can make a big difference in your book, but it's not inexpensive.
And I would always ask, depending on what point you're at in the process, ask your editor if there are funds available through the press to support that. The answer is probably no, but you should ask, and definitely don't cold email an editor with your proposal for the first time and say, I know this isn't quite there, and do you have funds available to help me make it better? That's a little dangerous, but yeah, I never, don't be afraid to at least put the question out there and see, because you never know what kind of funding models that we're working on, or what kind of grants might have come through, or what kind of donations to funds that we might have for editorial development. Again, rare, but always ask.
Thank you so much, Katie. And thank you all. This is so informative. And I think, as we've said before, I wish I had this before I had published my own book. But I'd love to to jump to a question that Travis had early on. At what point in the process of revising the dissertation into a book should I start drafting the proposal? We touched on this a little bit. He also asks, I would feel that I would want to know what the publisher is looking for, how to shape my revisions towards something they'd actually want to publish before I put too much work into drafting a proposal that won't appeal, or writing a book they won't want to publish. But at the same time, every workshop and webinar I've attended has focused on the proposal as the first time you contact the publisher. So is it typical, or even if atypical, is it okay to contact the publisher earlier in the process to try to talk with them about writing the proposal they'll actually like and writing a book they'll actually want to publish? So the first piece of that, just in case we lost it, was at what point in the process of revising the DIS into a book should I start drafting a book proposal? And I might toss that first. Let's see. Maybe Katie, if we could start with you again. Sorry to
I don't know. It seems it seems almost like a personal preference sort of question. It depends on the person and what the project is. If you're going to do additional research, how much space you need, how quick of a writer yeah, it totally depends. And I'm happy if somebody else has better advice than I don't know for everybody.
Other thoughts? I know the advice that I remember receiving from various mentors and advisors and such was to use the proposal writing process itself as a way to kind of clarify my thoughts on the project. In fact, I think one of my advisors is here in the audience. Fred, if you were there, thank you for all of your wonderful advice through the years. But it really functioned very well that way, as a way of saying, what is it I want to say, right? And I did a number of iterations just on that book proposal. And at that point, I had only written one chapter of the book. I had outlines of everything else. I had ideas of what I wanted to write, which of course you have to write into the proposal, little chapter blurbs, or sometimes more lengthy ones if you can flesh them out at all. But that was my own experience. I'd love to hear others' experience with kind of at what point it was helpful for you to write that proposal.
I'm always telling people that they need to write a proposal, even if they have a full manuscript, in part because, well, just in terms of approaching publishers, it makes their life easier and it makes you more likely to be successful. But if it's at an earlier stage, a proposal is a place that forces you to articulate these questions of audience. And it forces you to articulate these questions of why this book now, and why am I the person to write it? And getting that down on paper can really help. And putting something that looks like a chapter outline, knowing that you can change it later. Nobody is going to hold you to the exact chapter outline that you put together. But putting that down on paper in a proposal, it can be a roadmap. You know, having written 2 books myself, I know I got lost multiple times. And you know, having that roadmap that I could go back to and reminding myself why I thought it needed to have those particular chapters in that order was so helpful. It's just, in my opinion, it saves so much time later. Not everybody works that way, but in my experience, it generally does help a lot.
I can also just offer from my experience with the distance cure. When I did write a proposal, the proposal is part of clarifying for me the work that needed to be done in the book to make it the book I wanted to have. And I knew I wanted it to be for MIT. If you look at all of, you look at all of your spines, for me, MIT was the great dream press, and I'm delighted to have it there. And not say, because the book is on teletherapy, on a psychoanalytic press. But, if I had written the book in one direction, it would have necessarily been more towards those presses, which I love and read lots of also. But I knew sort of what an MIT book felt like, and made the proposal not only with the downloadable guidelines on MIT's website, but with that in mind, which then left me the obvious revisions to do. And so I didn't even, just to Travis's exact question, I was able to be the publisher in my own head and say what I needed to do to make the book that they wanted to publish, apparently, and that they liked. So the proposal can function that way too, before you even approach like a proto query.
Thank you so much. Oh, yeah, please go ahead.
I was going to say, just to offer an amplification or reiteration, but also a counterpoint. I also, with both the proposals and books I've worked on, find it super helpful as like a roadmap and a touchstone. And it's like an old friend who will tell you what you said before, which doesn't mean you still need to say it. You know, it doesn't still need to be the thing you think, but it's like useful to be reminded that that's what you once thought. Very helpful for writing introductions and conclusions in my experience. But I actually, and this may really just be a personality difference, just wanted to say, perhaps because I felt like I needed to be given so much permission to like show people things that weren't totally perfect or finished, that I also found that it was very clarifying to like share bits of that with people. In one case with the university press editor, actually, or like with my agent. And I think as someone who at one point maybe felt imprisoned by the need to like figure out exactly the thing before I showed it to anyone, that roadmap forging can also be at least a somewhat dialogic or collective process, I think, sometimes. But that, I think that's also probably a personality difference for how different people clarify their thoughts.
No, but I think that that's so key, finding readers you trust who don't necessarily have to be the your dream editor you're going to approach at a UP or your dream agent, right? But having someone look at your query, you know, before you fire it off to Caroline or before you approach Katie, I think is great. And for those in grad school, right, there is all that scaffolding and institutional support, but it's important to find other kinds of readers too, especially if you're not still in graduate school, or we have people in the audience who aren't in the PhD, which is really exciting too.
And I found also, one editor once said to me, who I was just talking to socially, that he found the difference between a dissertation and a book. And I don't know if Katie would agree with this, but that a dissertation, you're sort of like mastering an area, and it's like, okay, so here's your topic, and here's a chapter about one aspect of the topic, and here's a chapter about another of it, and that's really good for a dissertation. But that he wanted to see books and book proposals with like more argument and more momentum of a certain kind. And I at least found talking to people and sharing ideas with people really helpful for that sort of moving from a topic that I was interested in all aspects of, or a topic field, towards like an intervention or an argument.
Yes, just to pile on a little bit in my role as host, I workshopped not just my proposal, but every single chapter in my book with multiple friends and colleagues and mentors over the years. They all gave me fantastic advice on sharpening my message, developing that network of friends, not just for books, but for articles, for everything you write, is so crucial, and honestly such a joy for me to have my things read by constructive friends, and also to read their stuff. So that's sort of a separate piece, but certainly related. So we had a question from Sam some time ago, and several plus ones on this. What sort of restrictions might apply if one were to write an academic book and a trade book on this research project, but with different framing? So kind of splitting off and doing a bit of both. Is this something, something you've encountered?
We don't, this doesn't come up that much. I would say that there are certainly topics that cross my desk where they've been written with a serious push toward the scholarly audience, and I see potential for a larger trade book, but the author has to want to write that and be capable of writing it. So that's really the major consideration, and it's up to an author what they're hoping to accomplish or what they need to accomplish with a book. So there's that piece. There's just the contractual piece, which is that, you know, you promise not to publish a book that is competitive with the book. Like if you're publishing that scholarly book and you're going to publish the trade book, you know, those are talking to two different audiences. So you can really get into the weeds, I think, legally there in terms of fighting that fight. But I would say, just to avoid that, talk to your university press editor about your aspirations to publish a trade book on the same topic. They would want to know about that. They may want to publish it. They probably will want to publish it. If you want to move on to a trade press with that project, I mean, just have that conversation. But that's what I would say.
I really want to hear what Caroline has to say about this question, but I will say I get this question all the time, but it tends to be from established scholars working on a second or third book who tell me, like, so it's before it's actually ready to go as a proposal. And what they do is they write this really conservative proposal. And then in the phone call, they tell me that they're actually saving the good stuff because they wanted to write a trade book later. And so those conversations are often about why do you want to do that? One person who we don't have, one category of person who we don't have on this panel is a book coach or a book therapist. This is a whole other category of kind of book professionals who are out there. And so sometimes I actually refer people to this other category book professional who is even better at helping people figure out why is it that you actually think that you can't write the book that people would read? Because sometimes they're not even talking about like developing a narrative nonfiction, like a true trade. They don't even mean that. They just want to write like a slightly tradier book, like a crossover book. And they think that that won't even be acceptable. And often those conversations, it's not clear to me that that's true. And I think, the university academic employment can be so traumatic in so many ways. I think that it really fills people with a lot of fear that is not helpful. And so I don't want to say that there aren't moments where a person might legitimately want to take a book and slice it two different ways, one a much more scholarly way and one a trade way. But especially if it's not your first book and you have the opportunity to make other kinds of interventions, given what has happened with the state of the academy, I would just encourage people to think about, just write the book you want to write. Life is short, make the intervention. Don't write the frightened book. Write the important book that you actually care about. But I'd love to hear Caroline's answer about how plausible it is that you can actually spin off the second book. I mean, that's the other reason I tell people not to do it. I'm like, also, it's not going to happen. You're going to spend 5 years writing the narrow book and you're going to be bored and you're not actually going to write the important book. So just write the important book.
Right. I mean, I come at this more from a trade angle, obviously. And I, obviously understand that there are reasons why somebody might say, like, this is my subject, I'm passionate about it, but I have to write a scholarly book, even though my heart kind of says a trade book. I do think that from a trade perspective, really, if there is so much overlap between the books, like a trade publisher is going to be a little uneasy about that. Like, it's that competition thing that we were talking about. I mean, there are literally contractual clauses about this in contracts, and you could kind of make the argument that they're for a different audience, but you're talking about the same person writing about the same subject two different ways. Fundamentally, that's a lot of overlap. And I mean, I think ultimately, not everybody is inclined to write for trade. That is aside from expertise and research and ideas, that is a different set of skills. And I mean, I think to a big extent that the market will kind of tell you in the form of agent feedback and press feedback whether that's viable. But I think, I mean, I have not experienced somebody coming to me who's already written exactly the academic book on the same subject or who's thinking about doing both. But I would think that, just trying to put myself in a trade publisher's shoes, there would be some squinting at that, at sort of that having existed in the past, if it really was a true overlap between what the books were.
Awesome. Thank you so much for clarifying all of that. So we have a bunch more different questions still coming up in the chat. And one of them allows us to get at something we haven't really gotten at, as well as the true question itself, which is how much does it matter when you, especially KD, see an academic book that parts of it, but not too much of it, maybe you could talk about that, have been published in academic journals, have gone through peer review at some level. And then also maybe we can use this to talk about that word platform. So if part of the platform for an academic is their academic profile, what else might be an academic's platform from Caroline's perspective, from Moira's perspective, from Xiaowei's perspective?
Yeah, it depends. I'm used to seeing maybe 1 or 2 chapters that have appeared. They've been adapted. They appeared as articles, but then have been revised and are going into the monograph. And that's totally fine with me. I support that. Once we start getting toward half the material or more being previously published, that becomes concerning, just because I think, well, what is the value added of a book now? So that's my straightforward answer there. In terms of, what was the second part of your question? Sorry. Oh, platform. Yeah, so academic profile, Twitter profile. I pay attention to that in terms of a trade. How much is the author going to be able to promote their own work? How much of an built-in audience are they already going to have when the book finally hits? That's an important consideration, but also since we are a university press, I sometimes think of us as like, the lily pad or the stepping stone to when you really will need that huge platform. If you are making an interesting and original argument and you can write, I want MIT to be the place where you start to build that platform with the full and sad expectation that you will probably end up leaving me for your next book and going somewhere else. I hope that you don't, but you probably will. And I think that's just part of working at a university press and expecting that we're helping to grow people's careers and grow that platform too, if it's not already built in, if we see potential for that.
From my perspective, platform kind of has 2 elements. So it's authority and audience. So authority, of course, is like, what institutions are you attached to? If, what publications have published you in the past, sort of what gatekeepers have approved of your work, essentially, sort of what have you contributed to the field? Who are you in relation to the subject? And then audience is sort of, who are your professional networks? Do you have a big social media following? Do you bring reach with you that extends, that can coexist with the reach of the press? And I mean, I think the truth of publishing books is that there are a lot of books that come out and it's really hard to make noise around those books. And that when an author arrives with the ability to make their own noise, that is a bonus for a publisher, that, the author is going to be able to connect to some of those readers directly, and increasingly that side of it is very, very important for trade. Especially with, and I think those two things for trade really are sort of very, very critical to sort of especially idea-driven books.
Fantastic. Hannah, do you want to go ahead? Feel free to. Okay, sure. So this is a little bit more forward-looking than the topic of this particular panel, which of course is focused on proposals and that kind of pathway. But let's say you've submitted your proposal. You know, as an author, you get good. It goes well. It's pitched right, and you're offered a contract. What makes a good contract? What's important to look for? What points are maybe negotiable? This is originally a question from Maya. I am augmented it slightly, but thank you, Maya. And maybe we can start on the university press side, and maybe if Katie and Audra and Moira has experience with it too, we can start with that.
Yeah, I think again, it's unique to the individual and where their priorities lie. It's unique to what the book is going to be. You know, I will have some authors who are writing a scholarly monograph be like really insistent that they get to keep dramatic rights. You know, you can keep the movie rights for your scholarly like that's fine. I think the obvious ones are probably royalties. I mean, whether or not a book is going to be open access. I get a lot of questions about deadlines, and I think that's probably the most nervousness that I get is about deadlines and what people are committing to in terms of saying, I will have a first draft to you this date. I'll have a final draft to you this date. For me, most cases, I just have to plug in a date. And after that, I think of it as a conversation. I think that we all have lives and pressures and job pressures and family pressures and now pandemic pressures. So, you know, I want to be understanding of what is going on in people's lives. And if they need an extra week or month or 6 months to make the project better, I want to be able to give that on, and like the same side. I would ask for the same sort of understanding in terms of if you're going to send me your manuscript 6 months late, don't expect me to like drop everything that I'm doing and read it that day. So yeah, I think probably just whatever the royalty structure is, if you're getting in advance, a conversation about the advance, due dates, and I'll often get questions about a next book clause, which allows editors a first look at whatever you're working on next. And I would just say that I'm happy to have conversations with you and explain to you anything in the contract that you're confused about or you have questions about. I'm happy to negotiate on the things that I can negotiate on. And there are some things that I just can't negotiate on because either they don't make sense or, you know, I would love to pay you $1 million to write your scholarly monograph, but I also work in a not-for-profit university press and you need to keep the lights on. So I think that it's a two-way street and you should definitely ask questions if you have them. Never be afraid to do that.
I'm going to give the wet blanket version of that answer. Well, although you should always ask for something. I mean, I'm just of the opinion that everything, you know, anytime you're in that situation where negotiation should happen, you should always ask for something. But in terms of what Katie was just saying, realistically, university presses often don't have as much wiggle room as one would like. And traditionally, the contracts that university presses will offer their authors look terrible from a publishing law perspective. Most university press contracts include things that say Writers Guild law rules will suggest you should never ever sign to. And the truth is that if you're writing a first book and it's a scholarly monograph, you may not really have a lot of room, and you really need to think about what battles you want to fight and what is more important to you. Is it more important to you that this book gets published because that's what you believe you need to get and keep a job? Or is it really important to you that it be open access? Or is it really important to you that you hold the copyright? Because you may not win that fight. You can try. But if you don't have an agent and you're dealing with the university press, at the most basic level, you need to make sure, as Katie was saying, the deadline is really important, and the word count. The word count and any issues about other parts of the apparatus, that needs to be crystal clear, because those are the things that they can hold you to. And if you turn in a manuscript that is 50% longer than it was contracted for, they are perfectly within their rights to say, we can't do this. So be thoughtful about what you tell them you mean for the word length, and make sure that that is then what you agreed to when you see the contract. Those are really, really the most important things if you are in a situation where you only have one offer from a university press. Ask for the things you want, but think realistically about what you actually want out of the negotiation. But so hopefully Carolyn can tell us more about what a better contract looks like.
Unagented contracts, man. give me goosebumps. I don't like them. I mean, it's a very different perspective. I mean, agents are dealing more primarily with trade presses, dealing with university presses too. I mean, from our perspective, we are often submitting to many publishers at once, trying to make the situation competitive, which can help in terms of raising the advanced level for the project, as well as sort of giving the author more of a broad sense of who they might be able to work with. Royalties, obviously, in trade, royalties are flat, really, really flat. They vary more when you go into university and small press deals. The very notion of giving your copyright away makes my heart clench because you just don't see it on my side of things. You know, dramatic rights, as Katie was saying, is something we always hold on to, even in the situations when there's probably nothing there. That's just sort of a trade approach, is that the author should hold those. You know, I think, again, I'm just really coming at this from a trade perspective. There are, you know, deadline is important, but as Katie kind of alluded to, generally, especially if you're, you know, if there's nothing incredibly time pressing about the book and the press continues to want to publish the project, usually getting an extension of weeks or months is not a problem. Years is when you start to have a problem. Then it can start to be like, are we going to get the book? Of course, this is all kind of a dialogue, but you know, you want to set a deadline that you think you can hit, but in many situations, that's not like a total drop dead issue, though it is, you know, as Audra said, they can hold you to it. So you just have to know that they can, that it just doesn't play out that way tremendously often, unless there are other issues with the book or the author. And, you know, option clauses generally are included, but you do, you know, how like next book clauses, we tend to see them in almost all scenarios in trade presses, but you know, what do they have the right to look at? How long do they get to look at it? You know, you then want to be released to basically do whatever you want if you can't come to a deal. So those are important. I mean, a contract, I mean, really one of the things that an agent does when they look at a contract is they read through it and think, what are all the ways I can imagine something going wrong, or I've seen something go wrong before, and what are all the ways that I can protect the author from that happening with this contract? Knowing all the same that certain things are just non-negotiable, they're just part of contract publishing norms, and also that certain things you can just never predict, so.
Awesome, thank you. And I might, just because it's kind of related to contracts and to like negotiating these things, Will asked a great question about visual material, photos, maps, figures. What are the ways to include these without totally, as he says, totally melting down the project? Of course, there's image licenses, better when you're taking your own images of objects or places. And then the actual publishing costs of images, black and white versus color, size, number. I've seen senior scholars shudder when remembering image clearance processes, he says. And I remember myself, this was a piece of the contract. This was something that was part of it. I could kind of negotiate what images I wanted and in kind of what formats. So I don't know if Moira and Xiaowei, you want to weigh in on your experience as if you included images, and then I'd love to hear from the others.
So any images that I tend to have for articles and books are images that I've taken myself, partially knowing that there always ends up, you know, I think previously running into some issues with like the cost of using images. But previous to PhD world, I was working a ton in like design and tech. And so I did have that kind of experience to draw on in terms of like producing my own set of images. But yeah, harder with archives.
I was awkwardly holding up Xiaowei's book with a copy of with a picture that they took on the front. Conversely, I just wanted to say it was an interesting thing in my negotiation for my academic book because I didn't have a lot of images, and I know friends who are art historians or coming out of like film studies or disciplines where it's really important to have the images. That's been a big part of their negotiations, but it turned out that I don't have very many images that would be important to me for this book I'm working on, and then that gave a little wiggle room for some other things. But it was, I had said this in the chat in response to Will's question, but I had found that was a point where there was some negotiating ability.
Yeah, I think it's what does the book need to be effective in making its argument, making its point. I want images to be included if the book needs them to be included. Color is always going to add costs in the areas that I work in. If you want color, generally, I'll go to my production department, we'll price out how much that'll cost, and then you'll have to provide a subsidy to support that color. In the case of how many images, it just really depends on the content and yeah, what the book is about and what's appropriate. And if it's, you know, a zillion images, then in that case too, I might end up asking that you provide a subsidy to just help us out. Otherwise, you'll see the costs of processing those images and printing those images showing up in the list price of the book, particularly on the academic side. In terms of permissions, at the press, that is the author's responsibility, unless we've come to some other agreement with your editor, which is probably unlikely. But also there is guidance from, just ask your editor for, we have best practices in terms of how to approach permissions, how to approach fair use, how to organize your permissions so that we know what we have and, you know, if we can use your images for publicity purposes later or whatever. We also have a permissions department who can advise on individual questions if they come up. So I understand that it's scary and it's totally daunting, but we're also here to help you and answer whatever your questions are. So.
Fantastic. Audra, you've been adding such wonderful insights on the contract more broadly in chat. I'd love for you to just voice that as well for the recording. So I'm giving you some space.
Sure. I realized we were being sort of vague in terms of your specific question about what you should be looking for in your contract. And so if you're not agented, if you're doing this on your own, some of the specific things you should be aware of is that in a university press contract in particular, the authors are almost always responsible for paying for the indexing and handling the proofreading. Many authors do the indexing themselves. That's fine. Just be aware of that it's there. It's another thing you can ask for. They'll probably say no. You can ask for it. You should pay attention to the royalties and to the splits for e-rights and subsidiary rights. Subsidiary rights are all of these things like dramatic rights or audio rights or foreign rights. Pay attention to the splits in those things. I didn't mention if there is, for instance, a language where you already have contacts in and you're planning on selling those rights separately, you know, ordinarily in the contract, the publisher is going to have those. So you would want to talk about that at the contract stage if you were hoping to retain, say, Russian rights on your own and had contacts. There may be some wiggle room in the gratis copies if you know you have to give out a lot of gratis copies for permissions. Pay attention to things like revisions clauses and competition clauses. Some contracts include clauses that say that basically they can demand that you can revise the project, and if they refuse, that if you refuse, they can pay somebody else to do it. Try not to sign that. It's going to be in your contract, but you probably shouldn't sign that. University presses generally cannot change the warranty and indemnity clauses, especially if it's a university press associated with a state university. It's just not something that they can change. The other thing to be aware of is just make sure that everything you've been promised is actually in the contract. So for instance, if they're planning on a cloth release first, followed by a paperback release within 24 months, make sure that that conversation that you had over the phone or email is actually in the contract. Because if it's not in the contract, it doesn't count. And finally, just at least one university press that shall remain unnamed has started asking their authors to secure commercial permissions for their illustrations, and that's not something you should agree to do, in my opinion. And that's it. But do read them. Definitely read your contract.
So we have some questions that are both on sort of strictly now on the UP side and on the trade side. So maybe I could just ask a few from the audience of the UP side questions quickly. One is about the difference between an advance contract and a contract for the entire manuscript, if you might be able to talk about that. And in trade also, do you have to have the whole book written or not? How much is going to be written for various projects? So that would be one kind of question. And in parallel, what's the difference between approaching for a particular series at any of these, university presses versus addressing, an editor who doesn't have a particular series, but works on a list or more generally across lists at a university press? And advantages, disadvantages.
Okay, so the advanced contract question first. This can be an editor by editor consideration or a series by series consideration. I don't know if other presses have, I'll just speak from my experience at MIT Press. So I am perfectly comfortable offering advanced contracts if I think that they're appropriate. I would say most of mine are advanced contracts. So that would, it usually ends up being a contract based on proposal and probably 2 sample chapters. So then it's a standard contract that just says we agree to publish this contingent on positive peer review of a complete first draft of the manuscript. Sometimes that first draft comes in and the reviews are a little more critical than we would have expected. Usually then I would send the manuscript back out for review after there's revision, but that's a conversation between me and the author. I do publish one series, the Inside Technology series, that the editors prefer to only look at complete first draft manuscripts rather than they'll look at a proposal and tell you whether or not they think it might be a fit for their series. But they don't send anything out for review that's not a complete first draft unless there are special circumstances. So that's the difference between advanced and not advanced. But again, I would just, I would talk to your editor or talk to the potential editor you think you're going to work with and just figure out what their working style is there or what their philosophy is there. In terms of series, non-series, I work on, I don't even remember, I have a few in process. So I think it's 8 different book series now. But I also work in non-series, like my own general list. So a book does not have to come in through a book series. It could just be on my general list, which means you work just with me, as opposed to if it were a series, you'll work with me and a few series editors who will have more of an editorial hand in things than if it's just me, obviously, and only my hand. And then, oh, I can't remember. Did I answer everything right there? Sorry, it's 8:45, guys. It's going.
Thank
fried.
you. Yeah, I can't even imagine even here at 5:45. Thank you again so much for all being here, especially.
Yeah, no.
Yes, you did. And just to say, so then you could offer just a contract, which would be for a full manuscript also at any point. Yeah,
and that's really fine. If you want to write your whole manuscript and send that to me, that's fine. Usually I get a proposal and sample chapters first, but some people, just depending on where they are in their career and how they prefer to work and write, they'll wait and they want to send me the whole thing along with a proposal. But yeah, it depends on what you need. And if I feel like I have enough to run with just based on the proposal and sample chapters, I'm happy to do that. But I will, of course, I would let you know if I needed more material or I just didn't think it was there yet.
Awesome. Morgan, I think, has a question about marketing. And that came from someone in the chat about, do you want to go ahead, Morgan? I have it here too. from
Yeah,
Andy.
and this is from Andy. He says, not sure if any panelists have referred to this yet, but whether trade or monograph, should authors pay attention to the marketing plan? I'm guessing all of you would say yes, but maybe we can talk a little bit about what those plans look like, how it's different between academic and trade, sorry, and what the author kind of has to do, right? So Andy ends up, academic authors often loathe self-promo, and I think it is strictly the marketing staff's job. But yeah, talk a little bit about, like, you know, trade press marketing, academic press marketing, what the author does have to pitch in, and what that looks like.
Yeah, it depends on the book type. Again, you know, if you're writing a scholarly monograph, you don't need to be prepped to do fresh air. But, you know, it's still helpful if you'll get a toolkit from our marketing department that tells you the different things that you can do in terms of just making people aware of your book on social media, or or in your signature in your email, or, you know, whether it's giving you some sort of flyer ahead of the talks that you're giving. Today, I had a tip from a faculty board member who just had a book come out, and she made her Zoom green screen, just a picture of the book and information about when it came out. So I respect that when authors are shy about self-promotion, but we want people to read your book, and I'm sure you want people to read your book. And I think of us as a team in terms of helping to make that happen. So, and then with trade, it'll be a little bit different. Regardless, you will get a marketing questionnaire, which is often ignored by authors. Please don't ignore that. That is sort of a bare bones guide for us in terms of where we should start to position your book. Obviously, we have an idea of how to do that because we've been doing this for a very long time, and we have worked on many books that are speaking to probably the same audiences that your book will be. But having specific tailored information from you, you know, information about what conferences you go to, what bookstores are near your hometown, what mailing lists we should be looking at just in case they aren't already on our in our databases. Just the more information that you can give to us that's specific and useful and concrete is the better. So yeah. And I'll leave it to Caroline or anyone else with trade experience to talk about how trade promotion is different.
Yeah, I mean, I think that overlaps very much with trade publishing. You know, publishers have their own marketing ideas. You generally won't really start to hear concrete things from them until 6 months before publication, if not even a little closer to publication than that. But what you will get, which Katie talked about, is that sort of author questionnaire. I mean, what a publisher wants to know is as we were talking about platform, like, they have their own ideas for how to position a book and what channels they might use to sell it, but they want to use everything that you bring as an author as much as they possibly can. Like, what other authors do you know? You know, what institutions do you have connections with? Like, where have you spoken before? All of these questions that they might see as avenues that they can open up for publicity or marketing opportunities. What outlets have you written for before that they can talk to you about pitching? Even, I mean, author questionnaires will ask sort of questions about, you know, your personal story around the book so that they can think about how to, you know, for a trade book, how to sort of talk about your story, the story of the book in a different way, sort of around the book, like, you know, pitching op-eds around the book and stuff along those lines. And certainly, I mean, I understand that for an author, sort of shouting about yourself and your work from the rooftops feels terrible, but it is, as I said, it's hard to break through the noise these days. And it's, you know, it is a team effort between the publisher and the author. And, you know, the publisher also, all they do is shout about books on their channels. And, you know, people listen to that to varying degrees, but it is sort of a line of books they're shouting about, whereas an author sort of has this audience that's come to them for all these other reasons. And when they start speaking about a book, might listen to that sort of in a different way than a publisher who's, you know, on their social media channel, tweeting about books all day long, every single tweet.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So now we have a sort of penultimate or final question. I'm just going to combine a few. This question from Joanna asks, what to Moira and Xiaowei especially, but to anyone, what does trade allow you to do that academic writing can't in terms of flexibility or things like freedom or whatever else is in the question? And then interrelated, because also Moira, your first book came out also while you were still at Yale, right? What would you both have advice for the PhD candidates and students in the audience about how to frame a book proposal while still in graduate school specifically? So the grad school question on the one hand, and the more freedoms of trade or what it supplies also.
Yeah, I would say that, and Moira knows the story because she was the one who commissioned my book as part of the series. But I mean, I started off writing this book because I wanted to make like a zine about vinegar in China, right? And I think it really speaks to actually one of the things that I really love about Logic, which is as this kind of new independent publishing platform, we really try to spotlight maybe people who haven't ever written an article before, right? Who are first-time writers. And then we have editors like Ben and Moira who have spent a lot of time in publishing and have these amazing connections. And so I feel really fortunate in that sense that, being part of this kind of scrappier organization, like, Ben and Moira were like, okay, we'll take the risk. Like, Xiaowei's written an article, it went viral. they can write a full book about this. So yeah, I mean, it was very much like this side project in a lot of ways. The other thing too, so geography, I'm in geography and it's a social science. There's all sorts of like stringent things related to both what Will was talking about in terms of like images, but also with IRB and use of human subjects, all these things. And writing a trade paperback book, like it's more like journalistic, like, hi, I'm writing this thing. Can I talk to you? It'll be part of this book. And there is a level of more candor and just freedom in interacting with the people that I was talking with that felt really, really important and much more like I could make it in some ways. Anthropologists always talk about like, oh, fear of like exploiting the subject. Within trade, I like definitely felt like I could use different practices to be less exploitative in that way.
Yeah, I think right. So what is different about trade versus academic? I think in my particular case, it let me doing this book as a trade book. And again, it sort of came to be through a variety of circumstances that were like not premeditated and came to feel urgent in my life. And there was the opportunity to do it. And it was just like, things just happened. I'm sure you all will be much better planned after this, this group and this Zoom. But I think it let me cover more temporal ground and be more speculative than I could ever be in an academic book. And there are bad things, there are probably limitations to that. And actually, to touch back on something folks were talking about a while ago, I felt a lot of pressure to write that book really fast. I got my advance, I took 1 year off my PhD and I was like, I have to write it during this year, like that's it. And to be honest, in retrospect, I sort of regret writing it that fast. I'm taking a really long time on my next book to make up for it. But I think, and all that to say, I'm not saying it was the right way to do it, but I think it let me kind of move around and have sort of speculative or provocative thoughts or make connections, bring in some personal sort of voice that you just couldn't do in an academic book. In the same way, I do think also at risk of maybe being really obvious, like the big difference between a trade book and an academic book is like, how are you going to have enough money to have time to do the thinking and the creating or whatever it is you want to do? And the academic book is more likely to be a, to create a path to fellowships and professorships and like a certain kind of institutional support. The trade book, you're going to probably get a bigger, you might get a bigger advance, and maybe it opens more opportunities to do magazine writing, or, a YouTube series, whatever, like the dramatic rights that the monograph author maybe doesn't need to be as worried about. So I do think, at risk of being reductive, like it is also just this practical question of like how you're gonna make the life where you get the time to do the thinking and the work you want to need. And just a very last thing I wanted to say about this question of self-promotion, because it is so uncomfortable, but I find myself at Logic now in the position of like hawking other people all the time, and I love it. I love doing it. I think it is also, at least my experience with Logic has been that, and one thing I think that maybe if a lot of folks are still in grad school to think about is like lateral relations are really important. And part of what you're doing isn't just, trying to get people to buy your one book or the one thing you have on that occasion, but like building a kind of community that when your book comes into the world will support it and promote it because you genuinely have created relationships among people who are interested in some common things. And when I think of scholars I really, really admire, or, I think about folks like Safia Noble or Sarah Roberts, or people who've had like really big impacts with these academic books. I think also people built friendships and relationships and networks over years that I'm sure, I don't know those folks very well, but I imagine sustain them personally through the often very lonely process of writing and doing academic work. And that also makes that promotion process sort of feel organic. So I think, anyway, that's one way working on Logic after doing this trade book has changed how I think about it a little bit. And of course, it's always easier and more fun to hawk your friend's work than your own. But that was just one thing I wanted to add.
Thank you so much, Moira. We are just about out of time. I did, before we wrap up, just want to mention another person that we invited to be a panelist. She wasn't able to make it, but she does have a book proposal accelerator, and she has a new book out about a book on book proposals. Her name is Laura Portwood Stacer, and I just want to add her. I just added her info in the chat, so you can look that up if you want. Hannah, do you want to say our last words? Go ahead, please.
Thank you so much all for being here, both panelists and amazing participants. The chat has been incredible. We are really grateful that this was our kickoff event. We will be taking this recording and putting it up on our YouTube channel. So please do come back for our future events. They're going to be fantastic and all across the next full calendar year, I think through next November at the very least. So please do come back. There will be more workshops with a more STS focus, more publishing, on podcasting, on doing transnational networking. So thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you again. And thank you once more to our panelists for joining, mostly from the East Coast, where it is 3 whole hours later. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. And I also just realized that I have been unmuted for I don't know how long, so sorry about that. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Hannah, you crushed it.
Thanks. Let's